So it's 7 o'clock. We can start and anybody can join in as they come along. Welcome to Glasgow in 2024 Worldcon bid, a Worldcon for our futures. We are absolutely delighted to be alongside Adrian Tchaikovsky and Adrian J. Walker today for an author event, interview, reading and general chat. We're going to go with I was going to go with Tchaikovsky and Walker, but it sounded a little bit like Turner and Hooch, and I wasn't quite sure which one would want to drill more. So we're going to go with Adrian T and Adrian J if we're directing questions. And if you've got to specify that, then don't worry. The chat's been turned off to stop us having to monitor it. But if you want to ask questions, and there will be an opportunity, those will get fed through to me to ask the Adrians, then in the Q&A section of the webinar, pop in your question and you can comment on or upvote other questions as well. So, you know, and it will be questions, no comments. Okay, we're going to kick off in a wee minute with some readings, but first of all, I'd like to say thank you to you both for joining us from Leeds and Aberdeen. So I've been looking over both of your back catalogue. And Adrian J, you have 7 novels out so far, I think. And I'm spotting a trend in the last few. So we've got The End of the World Running Club, The Last Dog on Earth, The End of the World Survivors Club, and The Last Human. So there's a definite tendency there for end of world thinking. So,
yeah, I think I'm moving out of that slowly, but yeah, there was definitely a apocalyptic period.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that one, but it's interesting to sort of see where they are. And Adrian, I mean, you made me actually be careful around spiders just in case they evolved and took over the planet and remembered. So, but I mean, you're over 40 books so far. Over 5. did some counting, and one of the things I think we'll come back to this one as well is there's an awful lot of bugs in your books.
Mm-hmm.
There's a vast. So what's with all the bugs?
Well, I always felt they were something of an underrepresented demographic, and usually needlessly vilified. See Tolkien and so forth. I used to have a whole very complicated spiel about how insects and spiders were often used as a mirror to human nature in various, so Kafka's Metamorphosis and Pelevin's Life of Insects and so forth. And it was basically to cover up for the fact that I just really, really like insects. And yeah, write what you like.
I think it's you and Nedia Corafor, you're definitely going to get some bugs in the book. I think with Firewalkers, I was like, oh, here's the bugs, and then no, I was wrong. There was more. So just to say what we're going to be talking about tonight is Adrian's novella Firewalkers, which is out in hardback and in sorry for the thingy, hardback and in ebook, and the audio is coming out at the end of the month. And Adrian Walker's The Human Sun, which is out in ebook at the moment, and the paperback I think wasn't released wasn't there.
No, it's been delayed until September, just so there's some bookshops to actually sell it. Yeah. And the audiobook's coming out in June, I believe.
Brilliant, wonderful. So who would like to go first?
Are we doing readings?
Yes.
Shall I?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'll kick off right at the beginning of Firewalkers, so hopefully no particular explanations necessary. Right. The Massery Van Bults were coming in all the dry way down the Ugoe Road, and as Hotep would say, there was much rejoicing. They came in a real motorcade, big cars with windows so tinted they were like black mirrors, the back ends corrugated with heat sink fins so that Monsieur and Madame and all the little Massery Van Bults could slide untouched through the killing heat of mid-afternoon. People turned out for them. As their fleet of cars grumbled down the Ankara's one-maintained road, everyone spilled from their factories and repair shops. An impromptu half-hour holiday from whatever it was put food on the table. The kids jumbled out from their shacks and shanties, from all the hand-built homes that had gathered around the anchor like junk washed up on a high tide, never to see the sea again. They all cheered, waving scraps of cloth for flags. Didn't matter the colour, so long as it was bright, bright enough to see through that dark glass. They whooped and stamped, all of them, and Nguyen Sun Mao waved and hollered just like all the rest of them, because this was how you did it at Ankara Achuka. You did it whenever the new guests arrived at the Roach Hotel, because this was the only time you'd see them. They check in, but they don't check out, which was some ad from long back. Anyway, it wasn't Roach Hotel, not really, not to the face of the people who got to stay there, however briefly. Not to the face of the Wabenzi who ran the Ankara town, controlled the jobs, and who got fed. It had a fancy French name in 20-foot gold letters that loomed over everything in the township, just like the Ankara cable loomed over them and everything, going up forever. The motorcade was approaching the big gates of the Roach Hotel now. The first couple of cars just went in, past the guards and the guns, up the gravel drive, past the dusty space where there'd been lawns in Mao's dad's day, before the owners acknowledged that even they couldn't waste water on that kind of conspicuous consumption. Mao's dad had got to see the place pristine new before time and dust and the heat cracked the facade. Mao's granddad had helped build it, one of that wave of labour that had converged on all three Ankara points long back. They had locals, yes, but they got in strong backs and keen minds from all over, and it so happened that there'd been plenty out of Vietnam who'd needed somewhere that wasn't underwater right about then. The crowd's jubilation was ebbing. For a moment, it looked like the Massery Van Bults were going to screw tradition and just pass through that gate from which no soul returned. Then, after 3 cars had cruised on, the 4th stopped, and more men with guns got out. The private soldiers of the corporate compound noun that was the Massery Van Bults. And after them, some flunkies in suits, already pink and sweating in the seconds after leaving the vehicle's AC. Mao shook his head and rolled his eyes, but he kept waving his little flag because he had parents and siblings and they got hungry just like everyone else. They had little baskets, like they were giving out money for New Year, stacks of notes, a king's ransom. Sullenly, sourly, the flunkies began chucking the cash into the crowd, flashing the sweat stains spreading like plague zones across the armpits of their shirts. The crowd whooped. Children ran up and down the line, gathering it all up. The Wabenzi we redistribute it later, and plenty would stick to their fingers in the process. It would all go to buy just a little less than the last, because even these good old American bucks, these sterling pounds and rubles and euros and rand, bought less and less of the less and less there was to buy. Children, because it looked better to the guests of the Roach Hotel if it was happy kids rushing around to grab their bundles of old notes. Because nobody wanted real desperate adults slugging it out for handfuls of cash that might suggest that they weren't happy with what they'd got. Mao had thought the flunkies were it, but there was a special treat in store for all the lucky people of Ankara Achuka. Mao saw some kind of argument going on within that great big space within the car, bigger than the room he shared with the 2 sisters and a brother. The flunkies were protesting. No, go back, really, Ma'am, not appropriate. And then she appeared. A woman, white going on pink, broad-brimmed hat already wilting on her head. Her hair was like gold, like hair you only saw in adverts. Her sunglasses looked like poured mercury. She was waving back, basking not in the killing sun, but in the adulation, listening to the crowd go balmy because some daughter of the Massery Van Bults had graced them with a personal appearance. She threw something into the crowd. Artless, awkward, but it reached the front ranks, almost brained some old boy, in fact. Not a wad of cash, this, something heavy. A plastic bottle, rich man's water, the pure stuff. The inside of the car was probably lined with them. There was a fight after that. The half-brained old boy had the bottle, his neighbors wanted the bottle, the people next to them. Then the gendarmes had turned up out of nowhere in their riot suits and were wailing into the crowd and cracking heads because this sort of unruly disorder before the eyes of the guests just would not do. And Mao was bitterly sure that the chief of police was going to nurse a long, cool drink of rich man's water this evening on his nice veranda. and that old boy was going to nurse nothing but a headache. Then he looked at the Massery Van Bolt girl, and she looked so stricken. She'd done a nice thing, hadn't she? She'd shown the proper noblesse oblige, except it had all gone wrong, and now her day was ruined. He thought she'd actually stamp her little foot. But then she was back inside the car with her flunkies, so the cool air could get flowing again, and the rest of the motorcade was passing the gates, and everyone went back to work, or went back to not having work, and then below her turned up and punched Mao in the shoulder. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there would be much more applause, you just can't hear it right now, obviously. It's such a strong setting, and it's that sort of real kind of gut opening, puts you where it is, makes you feel that dirt and that dryness and that kind of thirst. And you're sort of sitting there going, no, don't throw water out. Oh, they threw water. That's going to be a riot. That's a riot. And it's that kind of parody of like at weddings where, you know, people used to throw coins out and somebody's about to get brained as they kind of run for the money. And you know, it really draws you in, and then changes up. I have to say, reading the start of it was not necessarily where I thought the book would completely go, and I think that's what's so wonderful about it as well.
It's a great opening. I love the rhythm as well.
Yep. So Adrian, would you care to do
Yes.
that?
I'm not going to start with at the beginning. I'm going to do a short passage midway through the book. So just to give it some context, this is written from the perspective of a highly advanced, genetically engineered, ultra clinical superhuman, effectively, as she rears a single human child as her own by way of experiment. So the whole book's written to the child, and this is around the time when he's about 5. Of course, it is not all crabs, smiles, and butterflies. You wreak daily chaos upon our dwelling, and I spend hours every day picking up and moving objects in your wake. But any balance I succeed in imposing upon our environment is almost instantly tipped. You do not wish to live in uncluttered space. And then there is the question of why. Why this? Why that? Why not? Why? Why do frogs not have 4 jumping legs instead of just 2? You asked one day in autumn at the riverbank near the top of the hill. It was cold and we had walked far. I wanted to return home. Perhaps one day they will. You mean they will grow extra ones? No, it will happen slowly over time. Why? Because that is how things evolve. Now stand up and let us walk home before it gets dark. Why do things evolve? So that things can get better. Come on. But things are all right as they are. Why do they have to get better? That is just how the forces of nature work. But why? Why don't the forces of nature work by things staying the same, or things getting bigger instead of better? Sometimes they do. What, get bigger? Yes, occasionally bigger means better. Other times it means worse. Read, it is cold, and will I get bigger, Ema? Yes. Will I be as big as you? Possibly not. You are very tall. I am. Now please, why are there forces of nature? This stopped me. I blinked and knelt down before you so that our faces were almost touching. Because the universe is a vast field of information with one goal and one goal only, to move that information from low potential to high potential. Once it achieves this goal, trillions of centuries in the future, its mysteries will be laid bare and it will have solved its own riddle. The quantum field of consciousness will be reunited, the dimensions will be compressed into a single point, and all will be pure awareness of everything that has ever happened and ever possibly could. You looked up at me, quivering, with your mouth agape. A breeze whipped by. Why? You said. Why is a question without end. Perhaps why is not a question at all, but an extension of your infant cry. Either way, I will never succeed in answering it. and neither will you. I sighed, lifted you onto my shoulders and walked us home, speaking more about frogs. As I say, your condition has not worsened. In fact, your episodes have not returned, and every one of Pire's tests reveal you to be an outwardly healthy boy. Sometimes it is easy to convince myself that they never happened at all. But the increase in your movement and the ensuing chaos brought its own challenge, injury. You began to fall almost daily, each time incurring a fresh cut or bruise. Sometimes you bled more blood than I knew what to do with, and your pain was difficult for me to bear. So Pire taught me how to make medicine. From a precise mixture of tree resins, fish kidneys, lichen, and 87 other ingredients gathered from the surrounding woods and waters, we formulated an ointment. Though rough to look at, not to mention smell, it works magnificently, acting as both a pain reliever and a healing catalyst. Gone were the tears and the blood. Gone was my misery at your pain. The Erta have never required such things, and outside of the halls of gestation, there are no laboratories in which to study the onset of death. Our own bodies are laboratories in themselves, deadly fortresses defended by armies of self-replicating nanomites and constantly evolving immunity engines imbued with a single goal: to kill anything that tries to breach their walls. In my lifetime, I have endured 78 serious viral attacks, 12 instances of bowel disease, and 4 bouts of cancer, and never felt a thing. And then there have been the strokes, the heart attacks, the countless broken limbs. If an Erta faces one certainty, it is that her death will be a violent, catastrophic event. But I had no idea how soon I would be reminded of this certainty, for the planet, it seemed, was just as hell-bent on chaos as you.
Thank you very much. I loved that scene with the whys, particularly sort of bringing back to Emma's sort of quietness and the chaos that Reid has brought into her life, that she, you know, the real hubris you set up right at the start. It's fair to say that Emma is the opening character, and right from the get-go, her purpose has been one of the higher purposes to rid the air of all chemical toxins and pollution, effectively.
That's right, yeah.
And she has this cracking line of, something like, I fixed the sky, I think I can raise an ape.
Yeah, I fixed the sky, sister. I think I can raise an ape. Yeah, that's right.
And it was just that moment where I was like, oh, this is going to be really funny. Because there's that sort of hubris setup of certainty of an alien thing being refocused there.
That was definitely one of the most enjoyable parts of writing it, was that that clear setup that she's going to find it more difficult than she thinks. And that I chose that passage because it was, I think, probably the most enjoyable one to write, the why, because I've been there, you know, with my kids, definitely.
And I think it's kind of, with both books, you know, really present in both books is that questioning, why this, why that, what, and also why is this the truth that we are believing? I think I would say is probably present in there. Was there something other than, you know, having to filter a child's constant request for that information, kind of as part of your thoughts about any of those, writing in the bigger questions of why?
Well, I've just always been fascinated by that question of why. It seems such an atomic question, you know, why? But when you think about it, it doesn't really make any sense, and it can be asked in two ways. You know, why has something happened, and why is there a reason why it's going to happen? But they don't really make sense when you think about it, because there is a never-ending question. You know, it just keeps going on. But it seems to be the one we're coming back to as children. I've always been fascinated by that.
And I think as well, Emma's stance on Reid and on life as an equation that will be solved, that the universe has an answer, that Reid will be an answer to something itself. And I think that kind of her having to deal with the questions that she's never really asked herself throughout, by giving answers, even though she always believes there is one, something finite.
Yeah, and also she's never really asked questions that don't need to be asked, before. That's part of their makeup, is they don't ask questions for the sake of it, which is something that humans emphatically always have done and always will do. It's just part of our makeup.
And I think that's a fair point in kind of in both books as well. And you say it very explicitly in The Human Son about curiosity and fear being kind of the driving part in humanity. And in Firewalkers, you have them going out seeking an answer to something, both curious and afraid, and then always having that, well, I could go back now, but I don't really know, but I could go back now sort of balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main drive in, I think if it was just down to curiosity, they'd never have gone anywhere near where they end up going. But because certainly 2 out of the 3 of the Firewalkers are basically living hand to mouth with large families to support, it is really much more, it's much lower down Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's basically they're doing it, and the reason they push on because they think we could go now, but we've probably not done enough to get the double pay we've been promised, and they'll stiff us because that's the world they live in. Therefore, they kind of they go above and beyond the call of duty purely because they need to make sure they're going to get as much as possible out of the life-threatening job they're forced to do.
No, I think that's really in there. The other part I kind of was from both is looking at ideas of evolution of a system, a power system, or a person or a planet. I'm not quite sure if I'm not quite sure if I've got the sort of real person there, because one of the things was while they were talking about how a system evolves to become corrupt, or how a movement evolves to fight that corruption, or how a person evolves into a self, goes from a non-thinking, non-questioning to a sense of evolved selfhood identity throughout. And I mean, I think probably quite tied to those questions, but do you think that that's something that we need to draw more and more attention to, the kind of evolution of thought and systems as well as kind of people?
I don't know fully how to answer. I can tell you a bit about the way I looked at evolution in the Human Son. As far as the Urtic are concerned, the main characters in the book, the advanced species, they are the question, the answer to the question that evolution has been asking on the planet Earth. They are the pinnacle. The questions have been answered, and that's it. There's no more evolution to be had on the planet. Although that does actually go against what was in that the passage I just read out. But that's why they want to transcend and move on to a different planet. But I think humans have an innate sense of evolution, whether that's on the planet, or whether it's socially, or whether it's in their own life. And I think that's why our stories always tend to be shaped in a similar way. There is always an arc, there is always a kind of development and a progression. And perhaps that's one thing that makes us human, is that idea that we are aware that things are in flux, things are changing. The stasis isn't really real. I think we know that innately. Whereas something like an Urta, which has no fear or desire or anything but its own purpose, doesn't have that sense. So that's how I approached it in my book. I'm not sure if that has answered any of your questions.
No, it is quite helpful, and once Adrian feeds in, I'll follow up.
And as far as self and systems go, there is certainly a school of thought backed up by a certain amount of neurological evidence that what we feel is the self is something of a bit of a skin over a much deeper structure that we are not consciously aware of, but that is kind of calling the shots. There are some experiments that suggest that we make decisions before we consciously make them, as it were, and then whatever we decide is the reason for doing things becomes post facto the reason we did it, but it's not necessarily the actual reason that we made that decision in the first place. And we are very, very good at post facto rationalizing what we've done and fitting it into what we feel is a coherent scheme of self that can easily be complete nonsense. So whether we are selves or in fact just systems that have evolved to think we are selves is a bit of an open question, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, from my personal standpoint, the interesting thing is you look at how an ant's nest works. Ants' nests are not the top-down structures people have traditionally thought. They make decisions by a kind of a weight of numbers on one side or another of an issue, and human neurons seem to work in the same way.
Yeah, I love that stuff about ants' nests. The idea that an ant doesn't really make sense on its own. It's the nest itself that is the organism, that can think in that sort of hive mind.
I think that actually really does tie, because in both books you both have a real thing about caring for the whole system. So the individual organism by itself, and the prioritization of the I over, and the want of the I over, and the whole system, for in some cases greater good questions come into play, and it has this interesting set of balances where I think in both cases characters talk about the knowledge of the whole ecosystem, not a single organism in it.
Yeah.
And I think in yours, Adrian, you have Emma talk to Reid about caring for the whole thing, that to care for something takes you out of your own head. It gives you a purpose to others that you become invested in. And I think that's quite an interesting posit, because one of the other things that's very clear in both of your books is this very strong anti-capitalist perspective on knowledge and not sharing.
Yeah.
and not sharing. And I'd love to hear more about that, to be honest. I tweeted a while ago a couple of sections from both of them, and it also really resonated with something from Emergency Skin by N.K. Jemisin. And it's that kind of, we're sending people off into space because we fixed this planet so badly, we won't come together to save it. And when we do, we choose, we exclude, we continually write by negation. They are not us, so only these people go. Or in the Erta's case, we are not slow, we are not jealous, we are not. So they say all the things they are not, to find the humans as that, to set them up as a kind of other. So I'd love to know more about the capitalist very strong fight the power feeling in both the books.
Shall I go, Adrian? I think there's a nod to the capitalist, the way that Earth ends up before climate change becomes too much in the book, and the Earth Reborn, is, I think she's talking about, I think she says, you used to bow to kings, you died bowing to CEOs. So there's a nod to it there. I think the way that the Erta in the book work is they live in very small groups of no more than 148. That's their optimum number of people that can self-organize together. And I think I got that from Sapiens, the book, Noah Yuval Harari, great piece of speculative non-fiction, which talks about this idea that over that brink, a group will become unable to organize itself, and beneath that, there's not enough cohesion to actually make it work. So I guess the idea for them of capitalism doesn't really make sense. The idea of pushing this idea of greed and wanting something for yourself doesn't really make sense, because they know that they can only exist in these groups, and they will only be happy, and they'll only be able to survive in those groups. But on a personal level, I mean, I don't go into it too much in the book, but I do think capitalism probably as a theory might work quite well. It's just that we haven't grown as a species to implement it correctly. It just was rushed in, and it's, when you have someone that's got 160 or whatever it is, 160, 180 billion sitting in a bank account, that's not capitalism. The money's supposed to trickle down, and it's not. It's going off into space. I don't know how that's happened.
Oddly enough, before the Russian Revolution, when he was sitting in Switzerland, I understand that's actually something that Lenin wrote about communism. This is the grand idea, but we are not ready for it yet. And then,
right,
of course, he had his shot and he went for it. And I think, arguably, he was kind of proved to be right by how it all fell out. But yeah, I mean, Firewalkers is much nearer future than yours, and there's much more, I think, of a straight line between where we are now and the future that I've set out, which I hope we don't end up at. But there, obviously, no one has done anything about the climate change issues. So you've got a band around the equator which is kind of uninhabitable. It's desert in Gabon, where the book is set. It's basically storm lashed and underwater over in Ecuador, as is mentioned early on in the book, and the only reason they're on the equator is because that's where you have your space elevator cables, because the physics of it requires you to do so. So ironically, having trashed the planet so that you can't live there, people have found, well, actually, we've got to go back there and make these little hothouse flowers of habitation. And of course, the only point of that is to have the elevator cable. And the only point of the elevator cable at this point is to get the people who have the money from the surface of the planet up to the very luxurious spaceship that they have built at the other end of the cable. Well, not the other end of the cable, in the middle of the cable, as these things work. And at some point, that spaceship will be full and will set off to go to Mars or to Europa or to some other solar system entirely, perhaps. And everyone left behind is going to be screwed. And that's kind of, as the book goes on, that's kind of the situation. I mean, they're getting to that point. Everything is shutting down. There's nothing left to be fixed. But the three main characters are sent out into the kind of the killing deserts as firewalkers, which is what the firewalkers do. Because the hotel, with all the guests who are about to go at the cable, its air conditioning is failing, and we can't have all the rich people suffering a bit of inconvenience, and therefore you get to go out into the place which is probably going to kill you to find out what's happened to the solar power fields. And so it is that this is kind of, I mean, this book comes after another one I wrote for Rebellion called Ironclads, which is a different kind of dystopia, but is equally concerned with that rich-poor imbalance. And in that case, it's the rich-poor imbalance in war and how that works. And in this one, it's very much, it's the people who could have fixed the planet. And we know, if the top 0.000 whatever 1% of the wealthy on this world turn their attention to it, everything could be fixed very, very easily. It wouldn't take and they would still be extremely wealthy at the end of it. But in the future I've envisaged here, that's not what they've done. Instead, they've thrown it all into creating this phenomenal space future for themselves, where they can set up an orbit or go wherever they want and just abandon the planet and everyone else on it who hasn't been able to purchase one of those extremely expensive tickets.
And I think as well, you do it in you, Adrian, you specifically state the scientists kept their secrets secret for monetary value, so they didn't, nobody would scoop them and get the money, let alone save the planet first. And an interesting point in The Human Sun is you talk about how the knowledge is hoarded and locked away, as you did with everything precious to you, and that when they try to save the planet, they do a United Nations SOS, effectively saying any scientist, any idea, no matter what it is, let's work together on this. But it's too late almost to bring enough people together.
Yeah, that's right. I'm quite interested in the the driving force behind technology historically, and it seems to be, you know, currently, well, maybe not currently, but in the last 50 years, the driving force has been consumerism and largely making a profit. Not entirely, but that seems to have been the driving force, certainly behind the devices we have in our homes. But there's also necessity. You know, technology came out of necessity back when we were a young species. But I think all the way through that, there's also the fact that people make technology because they're geeks, basically. I mean, you don't get many people working on computers and iPhones, or you know, people that made the steam engines, or you know, built the shelters, that weren't genuinely interested in the stuff that they were doing. They weren't doing it for profit or necessity. They were probably doing it because they got a kick out of it. I'm quite interested by how those two forces, the three forces, interplay. I think right now with the pandemic, we're probably seeing a higher amount of necessity driving technology, or we will do, than the consumerism. And I think that's probably going to be a good thing. It's been a long time coming. So yeah, not sure where I was going with that. Yeah.
No, I think it's good. So there's really amazing world building that's set up in these books, and you know, world building is quite a political act, but that would say they're both apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic texts, post and possibly still another apocalypse on the end of it kind of text, actually, with Adrian Tchaikovsky with Human Son. So if you've destroyed the world or are in the middle of destroying it or rebuilding it, what aspects do you figure into that rebuild while, you know, showing the bones of what you've left before?
Sorry, go.
I was going to say that I mean, my world building is probably quite small compared to the world destruction that I did in the Human Son. So the actual world building is quite fun because it's, you know, a blank canvas and it's a very small community, all based around mathematical principles. But the world destruction, I lent heavily on a book called The World Without Us by Alan Weisman, which is a thought experiment book. It's really good if you haven't read it. And it basically takes the premise that human beings leave the planet instantly. You know, there's no pandemic, there's no war, they just disappear. And the thought experiment goes from what would happen after the first hour, the first day, you know, the first week, all the way up to 10,000 years, about how the planet would first be a complete mess, with all the dams bursting and power stations going on fire and you know, fires going through forests. But gradually it would absorb the cities, and it goes into great detail about towns that have been abandoned after war, you know, ambushes and skirmishes, and how the plants are already taking down the pavements, and you know, pigeons are roosting in the buildings. But there's one chapter in particular that really stuck with me. It's called Polymers Are Forever. And the idea behind it is that eventually nothing will remain of humans. Everything will be absorbed back into the hillsides and the forests. But plastics will remain. They'll always be there. And we have no idea how that's going to affect the ecosystem if we left. So that specifically in the Human Son, that's why whatever I did to rebalance the planet, whatever the Yurta did to rebalance the planet, plastics were already going to be there. So that's why I created this small mini moon that orbits the other moon, which is the compacted plastic that we've had, which Reed looks at and asks about because it's another, you know, moon.
Why is there two moons? Yeah.
Why are there two moons? Yeah. So yeah, but the actual building of the world after that was, like I say, quite fun because it just takes some very simple principles about small populations and keeping your footprints light, which the Earth to do with ease.
I mean, for me, I'm going to jump on one of the Q&A questions because it kind of fits into my approach. We're talking about the worlds of Cage of Souls. The Cage of Souls is the book I wrote, I think it came out last year. It set much further in the future after civilization has risen and fallen quite a few times, and it's kind of at the end of the earth. And it's a science fiction novel, somewhat dressed up with a fantasy novel. And when I'm looking at that rebuilding, or at that describing the ruins of an elder civilization, that's kind of what, as a reader and as a writer, that's what I love to play with, the idea that there is an understanding of what you're looking at that the reader can gain, which can be very, very different and usually rather more enlightened than the understanding that any of the characters in the book have. So, for example, in Cage of Souls, they are aware that God in times past was often portrayed as a man with a very white beard, meaning God was very old. Hence, they assume God is probably dead by now if he was old back then. And that kind of perfectly inarguable logic based on what we've left, basically, just an incomplete understanding of relics. And, you know, it's finding the ruin of a building and realizing it's realizing that the towers in Gene Wolfe's Shadow of the Torture are actually rocket ships that haven't gone anywhere for generations, and people only think of them as places to live, but you realize actually that's an entire stand of rockets that citadel is composed of, and things like it's just that the disjunction that enough lapse of time makes between original purpose and then what later generations make of it.
I've always wondered what future civilizations will make of the stack of selfies that are on the servers we're going to leave. Why? Why do we take so many pictures of our faces?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because there's a brilliant moment in yours, Adrian, where the mirrors themselves effectively apply an Instagram filter.
Mm-hmm.
And
a really racist Instagram filter, in fact.
Yeah, very, 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 and I think that's an important point. And the character is like looks at herself and looks at the dirt that is also being sort of cleaned away and says, no, I know that this isn't reality. But I do think that that's quite a difficult one. Okay, so you've destroyed the world. You've rebuilt it, although there's a cracking line about utopias and the problematic survival of humanity within them in the Human Son, Adrian. But what was the most challenging aspect for you guys to imagine or conceive as a kind of, the reader will buy this, I can draw them in, or even to conceive would be possible for us as humanity going forward?
I think that the most challenging aspect for me was Ema's voice, because you are hearing this from a non-human, and her voice changes throughout the book, and it is all written from her to read. But she is an Urta, and the Urta don't understand poetry or art. They have no need for it. They're not against it so much, although they do become against it quite soon in the book. They just see no need in it. It's just a strange thing that used to happen. So for that reason, when she's writing, she doesn't use simile or metaphor. So nothing is like anything. It just is. So I faced the challenge of starting the book with her writing in that very clinical and clipped sense, but also trying to make the language interesting. You know, it's quite a challenge to start with. But the more I did it, the more freeing that actually was. That was a really liberating way of writing, when you don't have to liken anything to something else. You just say what is. You know, you're literally describing. There's a passage where she describes the change of light in her kitchen over the day, and she just marks the exact angles of the light on her table as the sun comes over the cliff, and it moves into a rhombus, and then it turns into something else, and that's it. That's the light. So a poet would have, you know, written reams of beautiful language about that, but she just sees the data, the information, and it actually became quite enjoyable. So the point at which I had to stop doing that, because she's starting to fall in love with the child, spoiler alert, was a little bit jarring as well. I had to actually get her to realize that she'd just written a simile. She'd just said like something else, and she doesn't understand why she's done that. I think that's all wrapped up with her humanity and how that builds through the book. So I guess that was the most challenging thing, to make that voice seem reasonable and believable at the same time as making it interesting.
And it's also something that marks her out as slightly different from the other ERTA, because some of them, because I was reading for that, and I spotted, the first simile, and kind of was quite amused as they started to creep in. I was like, oh look, there's another.
Yeah.
But the sort of when there's that limit of language that she talks about, and how you can't convey the information, the data.
Yeah, and she
eyes.
Exactly, and she talks about how science, or human science, is mostly poetry. An atom doesn't really exist. It's not really things spiraling other things. It's a mathematical construct. So she talks quite a bit about all the ways we've described systems in the past and scientific ideas as poetry, just as useless as any other poetry. So yeah.
Adrian, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, there's one Firewalkers doesn't do much of the non-human point of view in the same way some of my older stuff has done. I agree, it is a real challenge, and it's a joy to get it right, but it can honestly break your brain trying to fit your head around getting behind the sensorium of something that isn't human, because I think the temptation is always that you just do it as a human in a rubber suit, in a sense, or a human with a kind of pointy ears or a wrinkle on the forehead, or whatever sort of sci-fi or fancy metaphor you want to do, and really getting something that is still comprehensible to your human audience whilst thinking like a non-human is almost like the holy grail of science fiction writing. The biggest challenge in Firewalker was probably getting a conclusion to the book that was going to be satisfying to the reader, because frankly, if you look at the kind of where that future is going, there's even adding the kind of the more fantastical element that I do as the book goes on and things ramp up, most of the ways that story can go are very, very downbeat. And I mean, there's a lot of dystopian fiction that doesn't sort of turn away from that, but I do feel certainly as a reader, I've read books with that very, very downbeat ending, and they are very compelling. And at the same time, they leave me wanting to shoot myself sometimes, because the world is bleak, and sometimes you do need a little bit of escapism adding to the bleakness of the fiction. And so, yes, it was finding that course. And I've got to say, it's a very narrow line that the characters walk, and precisely how happy that future is probably up for argument. But even getting it to as positive as it was really hard.
Do you start with an ending in mind, Adrian? Or do you find your way there?
I plan the crap out of everything except the very last chapter. And the very last chapter, I let the rest of the book's trajectory dictate. And so it's usually, I know kind of the setup they're going to be, but precisely how that final denouement will go, I do not until I get there.
What about yourself, Adrian? Because one of the Q&A questions was wondering about your writing process and if it's changed much from book to book.
Yeah, I definitely am a planner now. I've got this A1 sheet that I basically just write everything down on. But I always start with an ending. I always start with a vague ending, and I think I've overdone it a bit in the last couple of books. I've overplanned, and I've probably written more notes than actually are words in the book. So the next one, I think I'll take a lighter approach. But I do like to know the map of the landscape. I don't like to know every single nook and cranny, but to know where I'm going and where it's going to lead me, I think is important. And I didn't. I started off just writing, which is fun, but you can get yourself lost, I think.
So, although I've got loads more questions, and we can maybe come back to them if we've got time. A question for you both is: what has been your favourite world to write, and why?
For me, honestly, Shadows of the Apt, the very first stuff I got published, is a world I could probably just keep going back to forever. I've still got a whole kind of backlog of stuff I would like to write for it, and then the commercial pressure isn't particularly there at the moment, but I understand that the series may be getting a re-release shortly, so you never know. Maybe there will be more. I mean, I guess I don't know whether it's something my readers are equally attached to, because it was a long time ago. But yeah, I don't know if it's just that was the first, or that it was based on a long-running role-playing campaign. But I feel it's a very comfortable world to slip into for me.
Adrian?
I was going to say The Human Son because I really enjoyed writing that world, but I've been spending quite a bit of time with the End of the World Running Club and the End of the World Survivors Club recently, because we've been writing a screenplay in the background with some other people. So actually that world, I never intended to write a second book. That was a one-off, a one-off book, and I was definitely against the sequel, but my publisher at the time convinced me. And the more I got into that world, the more I really could see how that could open up into a huge, adventure. With more and more bizarre communities appearing around the world. So I think that at the moment is my favourite world. I'd love to write more in that world.
We, I mean, reading both the books, and they have quite dark aspects, very, very dark aspects in them, but you both come across as quite optimistic. So question is, how do you maintain the optimism despite the dark themes of the human condition that you're looking at? And I do wonder if this comes back to something we were talking before we actually started as well, with humor. And
I mean, most people that have read certainly my science fiction will be aware that I reserve a lot of my optimism for things that are not necessarily human. So yeah, sometimes you just have to kind of look above, beyond, and elsewhere for your odds of salvation, I think.
I'm just screaming inside. Yeah.
sorry.
Sorry, I'm joking. I think I am hopeful about the future. I mean, the kind of destruction of the world and the post-apocalyptic things we write about, they're really just backdrops to character stories. It's not really disaster porn. They just provide very good landscapes to explore characters. But I am hopeful. I'm really hopeful in something that we touched about earlier, this idea of fear and curiosity, that our curiosity is going to win over and gets us through hard times. And you really only have to look about to know that despite all of the terrible things going on outside that window, we're still living in a better time than most people have ever lived in. And I know that goes against a lot of the events in the last couple of weeks. And those things definitely need to be addressed. But life on this planet has steadily got better for most people. And that's something to be hopeful for, because it means that we can go in the right direction. So I am hopeful.
Just sort of spotting something behind you, Adrian J. So this fits into this question. Do your hobbies affect the stories you write? Or do they throw in Easter eggs even? Yeah,
they definitely. Well, my obsessions tend to affect the stories I write. And the book I've just finished and sent to my agent has quite a big passage on a scene in a film called Crossroads with Ralph Macchio, which is a blues guitar kind of film, where he has a duel with Steve Vai, which is one of my favourite film scenes ever. So yeah, there's a fair bit of guitars in that book. But yeah, not so much hobbies, but obsessions. The End of the World Running Club I wrote when I was getting big into running and parenthood. So yeah, everything filters in.
Adrian?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Do your hobbies affect?
Oh, well, I mean, entomology is a fairly obvious influence, and I think a lot of people reading, especially a lot of my fantasy stuff, will see a lot of role-playing game influence, which is another big hobby of mine. I mean, God, other than that, I kind of feel like my life has been pared back over the last 15 years until the writing has been a fairly large chunk of what's left.
Mm-hmm. So it was specifically for Adrian T, but I imagine it will, having read Ema, be able to comment on this, Adrian. You've main characters of different ethnicities or neurodivergencies. What research do you do to ensure that to avoid inaccuracy or stereotypes, or hurtful stereotypes?
I mean, speaking for myself, I suspect that the hard answer is almost certainly not enough. I do my level best. Because I have a very world first creation process, whether I'm writing fantasy or far future sci-fi or near future or whatever, I try and make my characters kind of hopefully arise organically out of the setting I've created. And so if I've created the setting well enough, then hopefully I'm not reinforcing inaccurate or harmful stereotypes. Certainly with the neurodivergent characters. So one of the main characters of in Firewalk is autistic, and that's a major element of how she interacts with the other characters. And I've got to say, for that, she's based on my son, who is also autistic, and so I'm kind of just drawing from life at that point. And I do believe that, you know, I, as a rather comfortably middle-class white male writer, I kind of have a duty to make my cast as divergent as I can, and make the worlds I'm writing as divergent as I can. And it's something I've done right from the start, and it's something I'll carry on doing. And there have been colossal gaps in the demographics who've been represented in my books, and I'm still working on getting better at that, to be honest.
Yeah, I would echo everything you've said there, Adrian. I mean, I won't lie, it's a very scary line to walk as a white male author. You know, you want to be as representative as you can. You don't want to just write about middle-aged white men's problems. But at the same time, there's only so far you can leap into a different person's experience of the world, especially when those experiences have been so hidden for people like me, and we're seeing that right now in the last few weeks of how racism is so embroiled in our society. So to answer the question, it's, again, I probably do it wrong, but I do try. I try to avoid stereotypes by not going too deeply into a character if they are not a character I know, not from a background that I know a lot about. Interestingly, the last two books I've written have been from a female point of view perspective, and I was very, very aware of not wanting to do not wanting to be mentioned in the men writing women Twitter threads that you see. I didn't want to move boobily anywhere, or tit downwards, I think is the so the way I got around that, actually, it was, weirdly, Beth, who's in the End of the World Survivors Club, is probably the character I feel most close to in my own self. And I really just wrote as myself if I was a woman, I suppose. I know I can't do that very well, but that was what I tried to do. I tried to put aside all of the stereotypes and just write as myself. And that came out quite well with the help of my wife.
Yeah, oh, that's really helpful. So we're coming to the end, and I would probably say when these books were written, it would have been hard to conceive this being the environment in which they were launched. What do you feel about their presence in the world at the moment, and where do you think, because of the world at the moment, I mean, you both are publishing under somebody publishing house called Rebellion, which I think is right up there at the moment. Where do you think sci-fi and speculative fiction is going to go next?
Can I answer?
Yeah.
we've had a few panels. I think you've been on a couple that I've been on, Adrian, where this question has come up. You know, what will we be writing? And it's interesting to see how futuristic fiction has changed over the last 150 years with regards to big events. So you can have Jules Verne writing about magnificent technology before World War I, and then all of a sudden everything's about death rays and you know, terrible technology. And then World War II comes along, and then it becomes about invasion and communism, you know, alien invasion and the parallels to communism. So obviously this is going to affect things. I don't think it's going to affect things as much. Well, I hope it's not going to affect things as much as those big cataclysms of the 20th century. But I think the effect it will have will be that the tropes we use in sci-fi will shift a little bit towards how we behave with each other as humans. They'll be a little bit more gentle. One of the ones I think will definitely be there is social distancing. I don't think that's going to be something we can slip out of very easily. I think that's going to stick around for a lot longer than we think. You know, especially if this is going on for months, maybe a year before a vaccine, that behaviour gets pretty embroiled into a society. So I think that the tropes will change, and I think that the dystopian fiction we write will probably be a lot more hopeful. I know that because one of my books is currently was pitched to Netflix recently, and they loved it, but they don't want any apocalyptic fiction right now. So what they said was, come back in a few months and make it hopeful. So that's that. I think that's how it will change. You know, it's not going to shift dramatically, but there'll be that focus on the uplifting side of things. And big spiders.
I'm okay with there not being big spiders, to be honest.
I mean, empathy for the other has been a big part of my writing for quite a while now, but I think empathy for other people. I mean, one of the things we've seen come out of this situation we're in at the moment is both really the most laudable extremes of self-sacrifice and empathy, and at the same time the most appalling extremes of selfishness and just grotesquely non-empathetic behavior. And I think the ability of someone to actually feel for other human beings, and indeed to see other human beings as human beings, if they are not of that person's immediate sort of demographic, has really been highlighted in the last few months. And it wouldn't surprise me if that did become a bit of a theme of speculative fiction going forwards, and especially the idea that the ability to empathize with other human beings is a survival trait. It's the thing we've evolved that has put us where we are, and therefore perhaps allowing ourselves to be led by people who patently can't is not a great idea.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. I'm obviously shouting out massive recommendations for any of our people who haven't yet had the chance to read The Human Son or Firewalkers. I think you should grab them as soon as you possibly can. There are lots of independent bookstores that have them, or you can get them on eVersion. And The Human Son will be out in paperback in September, late August, September. But I'm going to ask you guys, since it's a pay it forward environment as a thing, what's your recommendation for something to read right now? Not putting you on the spot at all, but either something you've read really recently or a book that you think everybody should go out and read.
For me, I think a series that would fit very well into this discussion is Emma Newman's Planetfall series, especially books 2 onwards, which deal with sort of matters back on Earth. It is very hard hitting. It's beautifully written. There's some really ingenious plotting and sort of mystery solving going on in there, and they're just really good books.
Brilliant. Adrian?
I would recommend a few books I've read recently. Well, I definitely recommend The World Without Us by Alan Weissman, which I mentioned a bit earlier. The one I've just started is Goldilocks by Laura Lamb, which is great. And Eden by Tim Nevin, which is another running adventure, but through a futuristic wilderness full of horrible things. Don't think there's any insects, but there's big animals.
Reasons to keep running. Well, thank you both so much for this, and great thanks to Hannah Vaughan at Rebellion for helping us put this all together. Everybody out there, this has been Glasgow in 2024, a Worldcon for our futures with Adrian Tchaikovsky and Adrian G. Walker. If you would like more content like this, go to our website and please support us, and hopefully we can bring a Worldcon to Glasgow and you can all come and enjoy it. Have a great evening and a great Wednesday. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.